Hello everybody, hope you're doing well. Today we're going to go over Chapter 9, Social Stratification within the United States. Okay, so let's get started. So social stratification. We've talked about the American Dream before. This is it should be a new concept for you, but like I said, I'm going to hit the American Dream pretty hard. Okay, so social stratification is a society's categorization of its people into rankings of socioeconomic tiers based on factors like wealth, income, race, education, and power. And we're going to break down what those are and how they play into social stratification, okay, as we go through the lecture. And like I said before, the American Dream is the example that I will use, okay? So the American Dream is a promise, right? It's a belief system that as long as we're willing to work hard, we will be successful. Okay. Now, the American Dream is based off the concept, or part of the American Dream, or a big component of the American Dream is the concept, or the bootstrap theory. Okay. And the bootstrap theory is the argument that individuals should be successful based on their own effort. Okay. So if you're American and you're successful, it's because you did it without the help of anybody else. You made it happen. You materialized this American dream, this middle class life, this life of wealth, because you were willing to work hard. Okay, so the image to the right is somebody literally picking themselves up by the straps of their boots, which is a physical impossibility, right? You're not going to just be able to lift yourself up by your bootstraps, but that's what the idea is, right? The idea is that if you're successful within this country of opportunity, and this is a country of opportunity, if you're successful here, it's because you were willing to work hard, okay? And if you're not successful, it's because you're not working hard enough, or you're not willing to work hard to be successful. So the way it's set up, the way the system's set up is that whether or not you're successful, it really doesn't make a difference to society as a whole. If you're looking from a functionist perspective, right? From a functionist perspective, not everybody's going to be middle class. Not everybody's going to be wealthy. Okay, some people will be successful, and other people will not be. The system works fine like this. Okay, like I said, the bootstrap theory, bootstrap concept is something that we see a lot of. Okay, when we hear people talk about what's wrong with our country and why things aren't the way that they should be. Millennials get knocked really hard for this. So a lot of you may be millennials, maybe some of you might not be. Maybe Generation X, I forget what the cutoff, I think like 1980, 80, 81, 82. I think if you're born in 80, 81, 82, I forget what the cutoff is, sometime late in the late 90s, you're a millennial. And then after that, it's something else, something Generation Z. But millennials get knocked for this. Millennials are essentially viewed as individuals who are entitled. They want success. They want to be successful, but they're not willing to put in the work like other generations were willing to do, right? And that's where that sense of entitlement comes from, okay? So bootstrap theory is something that we place on, our population, our people. Lifting oneself up without the aid of others. That's very difficult to do. And I'd argue people that are very successful have had help from others. And what I mean by others, I'm going to argue by family members and connections, social connections, okay? So the more well-connected your family is, the more financially well-off your family is, the better your resources are going to be. Some of those resources will be better education, or access to better education, access to, networking. Your parents have friends that own companies. Your parents own companies. They're going to get you a job. I know, my buddy of mine works at this company here, or owns a company. He can get you a job. Things like that. That's networking. Okay, that's a very, very, very important resource to have. Okay, but bootstrap theory is going to argue that you should be successful without anybody else's help. Right? You're not using anybody else's resources but your own to be successful. And the idea is that we admire these individuals within our society. Right? That these are individuals that we look up to because these individuals represent what this country stands for. And what it stands for is the idea that anybody can come here and be anything that they want as long as they're willing to work for it, as long as they're willing to put in the effort. Anything's possible, okay? So this is something that we value here, all right? Like I said, it's the belief that hard work and talent and not prejudicial treatment or societal values determine social ranking. Okay, the idea is that no matter if long as you're willing to work hard and you're talented, you can overcome anything. And the idea is that there are people who do overcome a lot. Okay, there are people that are able to work very hard and put in the effort and be successful. Okay, but the argument is, or at least the question should be, are those people the rule, or are they the exception? Okay, are those individuals who are self-made millionaires and successful based on their own effort, are they the are they not the outliers? Like I said, can everybody be middle class? Can everybody be wealthy? I'd argue no. The system's not set up that way. Okay, so the problem that some people would argue with the bootstrap theory or concept is that it perpetuates the belief that people control their own social standing. And the argument against that is that depending on who your parents are, what families you were born into, the status that your parents have will dictate what status you have yourself to a certain extent, right? The idea is if you grew up in a working class family, you'll have working class values, working class culture. It'll be very difficult for you to move past that. Now you can. That's the thing. You can move past that, but it's the amount of effort that it takes to move past that. Okay, and the idea is it's almost like at this point now we might be almost even attacking the concept of free will, right? Free will is the idea that everybody has the ability to make their own choices. Choices that we make are our own, and that nobody can influence that. We have the ability to choose our own destiny. But the thing is, if you're born poor, or if you're born working class, maybe the choices that you have are limited by your status within society. The idea is that, college is definitely a means to, upward mobility, social mobility. But if your parents are not college educated, if they don't have the resources, if you went to a public school system that performs poorly when it comes to academics, you may want to go to college, you may want it bad, but you may not have the skill set, you may not have the education, the background to compete, successfully when it comes to moving into a college. So even though you have free will, the argument is that your free will, the choices you have, are still going to be influenced by your status. So that would be an attack against the bootstrap theory, the American dream theory. Okay. Next thing I want to cover. Excuse me. So, sociologists will argue, and this is pretty much kind of what I've been arguing already, is that society is a wide system that makes inequalities apparent. Okay, or that social inequalities is essentially built into the institutions that we live under or live with. Okay, there are always inequalities between individuals, right? And that's kind of something that we acknowledge, right? Depending on who you are and who you're being compared to, right? Like the image to the right here, we have, a race. You have a starting point, and then you have a finish line. So to the left, you have what would appear to be a Caucasian male, older. He's in a suit. So you might argue that he's, has certain level of status within society, probably educated, more resources, to better his chances of being successful within our society. Then to the right, you have a woman, appears to be a minority woman, and then you have the obstacles that are laid before her. So the argument is that the start point and the end point, that it's going to be the same distance, right, to success, to middle class life, to wealth, but it's the obstacles that are in place that have to be overcome in order to reach that finish line may be different for certain individuals within our society. Okay, that's the argument. Okay, sociologists are interested in the larger social patterns. And what social patterns are we interested in as sociologists? Well, so one social pattern could be education and how that affects upward social mobility. Access to education is going to be key, especially if you want to maintain a middle-class life. Okay, the idea is that middle-class life, the wealth that not even so much wealth, but the access to resources that a middle-class family may have may only be able to keep. So say if I was middle class, right? I'm a middle class individual. I have a middle class life. I have children. I can make sure that my children, as long as they're children, will enjoy and live a middle class life. But once my children become adults and start having their own families, my middle class life, the money that I have that affords me a middle class life, isn't enough to make sure that I have my middle class life and that my children, my adult children, will continue to have a middle class life. Okay? It's not like a wealthy family where somebody's family is exceedingly wealthy. Their children will be wealthy, not because they went to school, not because they're educated, not because of any effort that they do on their part. It could be a situation where those children remain wealthy into their adulthood because their family allows them to be wealthy through inheritance. Okay? So the idea is education could be one of those factors, right? One of those institutional factors that determines how successful an individual is going to be in their lives. Okay? So that's the argument. All right, so factors that define stratification are going to vary. Okay? So it depends on, and we'll go over some of the factors, right? So social stratification is an economic system based on wealth, the net value of money and assets a person has, and their income. Okay, so it's going to be all those things that are going to determine socially where you're at, what status you hold within our society. Okay, and other important factors can influence other factors can influence social standing, like who your family is. Does your family have a name? Depending on where we're at, that can make a big deal, right? If you come from a family that's a well-established family, right, like almost like a dynasty within our country, right? Kennedys would be a dynasty. The Bushes, families like that, families that have a long history of being powerful within our country. That's important. Okay, so your family name alone is enough to almost ensure that you'll be able to maintain your social ranking or your status. Okay. But when it comes to, other factors as far as stratification, like I said, it could be based on wealth, who your family is, the net value of money and assets that a person has. So it's not just the house that you own, the cars that you own, but it's other things, other investments that you have as an individual or that your family holds. That's going to determine where you're at in our society. Okay, and then just income, right? How much money do you make a year will definitely impact where you're at in our society. And then there's a concept of culture beliefs, right? So wisdom and charisma are valued, and people who have them are revered more than those who don't. So what is wisdom? What is charisma? When I hear wisdom and charisma, when I hear those personality traits, what I think of is essentially leaders. Leaders are expected to be wise. Leaders are expected to be charismatic. Okay? Those are the characteristics of people that we follow. Okay, so when it comes to cultural beliefs, you could argue that the institutions that we have within our society, and we'll say education system, just look at that, right? Certain education systems are responsible for teaching and passing on certain beliefs or cultural values. So what I mean by this is if you're working class or poor and you go to a public school that's not doing well financially, limited resources, the education you receive from that school might be more in line with preparing you for the position that you will hold in society as an adult. So if your family's working class, you live in a working class neighborhood, you go to a public school, that public school is going to provide you with the education for the career or the path that they expect that you're eventually going to take up, and that would be working class. So they're going to teach you to follow directions, they're going to teach you to behave, they're going to teach you to respect authority, not to question, okay? Because what's going to happen is that once you leave that school, you're going to go work in a company or a job somewhere where, those, I don't even want to call them skills, but we'll just say skills will be useful to you, right? You've essentially been socialized to be subordinate, right? To be a good worker. The opposite of that would be individuals who are wealthy. They're going to send their kids to private schools. They're going to get the best educations possible, but not just education. Okay, it's going to be an entire. Um, it's an overall. So essentially, what they're doing is that they're providing with the education, but also what they're providing them with is a network. Okay, a network that's going to allow them to go and work for companies, go and work for government, go and work and assume positions, leadership roles and positions within our country, within our society. Okay, that's going to be the difference. And in those schools, they teach those kids to be charismatic. They teach them to challenge and to be critical thinkers. Okay, those kids are taught to be leaders, so the future leaders of our country. Okay, and that's kind of the way the education system's set up, right? So that would be my take on cultural beliefs, right? As far as wisdom and charisma being valued and how they're being valued. Okay, so in some cultures the elderly are esteemed, in others the elderly are disparaged or overlooked. So that could be one cultural, expectation. That's one from the book, right? That the way we view elderly people within our country, and really what they're arguing is that people that are elderly are viewed as weak, maybe feeble-minded, maybe no longer useful, maybe even a burden, right? If you're elderly. But if you're considered an elder, that's somebody who's considered wise, somebody who's respected within a society. So that's the way the book was going to frame it. All right, next important thing we're going to cover is social standing factors. And it's actually something we've already kind of talked about, and I do apologize if it seems a little redundant. Some of the concepts and theories from this chapter, it's really more the concepts, not so much theories for the most part. They are a little repetitive, so I'll try not to test you guys on a bunch of different concepts that are pretty much identical or very similar, because I don't want you guys to get confused, because they are confusing. I'll admit they can be very confusing. So social standing factors, essentially what we've already been talking about, right? Parents tend to pass their social position onto the children. Makes sense, right? So if your family is wealthy, if you're born in a wealthy family, you will be wealthy. Just by the simple fact that that's a family you're born into, and you will benefit from that wealth. Not even just talking about cold hard cash, but I'm talking about everything else that goes along with it. The culture, the beliefs, the access that you will have. Those are all things that you're going to inherit. So people inherit not only the social standing, but the cultural norms that accompany a certain lifestyle, right? And that's really what it is. Like me myself personally, right? I'll use myself as an example. If we were in class right now, I'd ask you guys to share, personal experiences in your own lives, that can kind of help us understand what these things are. But I'll do it myself, right? So me personally, I come from a working class family. So growing up, my family struggled financially. Okay, we did well enough so that I didn't want for anything essential, right? Everything that I needed, I had. But it was the extras that I didn't have growing up, okay? And I had friends who had the extras. Like I had one friend that his family made very good money, and his family, they took vacations, right? They liked going out to the desert, dirt bikes, quads, RVs. They had the extra income, the expendable income to go and purchase those things, in addition to taking care of everything else that they need to take care of as far as maintaining a family. So that was something that I noticed growing up, right? That my family wasn't exactly the same as other families, and there's a whole cultural component to that too. Like my friend's family, not only did they didn't just go to the desert, but they also traveled to Europe, traveled to a lot of other places, and that is a luxury. 100%. That's not something that I experienced growing up. That wasn't something that my family could afford. Okay? So like I said, it's not just money, but it's also experiences and being exposed to other cultures. And that is part of a culture. The ability to, partake in travel and to purchase, vacation homes and things like that, to experience other things other than just being one little area. Okay? And then the whole idea of sharing a network of family and friends that will help you. This is something we've talked about. Okay, like I don't know how many of you have ever experienced this, but for those of you who have, you'll know what I'm talking about. How many of you guys, this is the question I'll ask you, how many of you guys have a job because of a friend or because of a relative? Okay, Now, I've gotten quite a few jobs because my friends have helped me. I had one job that I actually argue I had no business having because my friend was a manager of a place and he got me the job. He was in charge of hiring, he hired me. I had no business in that job whatsoever, but I had that job because of my friend, right? So that's another thing that social standing factors, that's another part of social standing factors is that the access of people or the people you have access to and what they can provide for you, okay? That's huge. Now, if your family is middle class, upper middle class, wealthy, like you will have outstanding connections based on your family and your friends and the community that you're a part of, okay? Now, if you don't have that, well, that's unfortunate for you. It's going to make it difficult for you to find employment, to find good employment, okay? So, social standing factors become a comfort zone, a familiar lifestyle, and an identity. And we do have that. Like, I would argue with that 1%. You know, your social standing within society does become an identity. You know, we've seen this historically, like blue-collar workers, that's an identity. Middle-class families, that's an identity. Wealthy families within our country, those are identities. So all those have identities. Like if you ever watched Roseanne, the television show Roseanne, I'm not talking about the newer ones, I'm talking about the old ones that came out like in the 80s and 90s. Roseanne is an example of a working class family. They have an identity. For those of you who might be familiar, like Bruce Springsteen, the musician, he made an entire career, he made a fortune out of being working class, right? His music is the music of the working class, okay? So it does have an identity, your social standing, okay? And then we're going to talk about really quickly, the Great Recession. And really what the Great Recession was I'd say maybe 2007, 2008 is when it was in full swing. But a recession is just a period of prolonged and exceptionally high unemployment. So we experienced that in the mid 2000s, like 2007, 2008. We're experiencing that now. So the things that are going on, okay? No one's completely insulated from a recession. So what that's arguing is that everybody will be affected negatively from a recession. But depending on your social standing will determine how negative that impact is. So if you're poor and working class, blue collar, you will be impacted severely by a recession. You're losing your house, you're losing vehicles, you're ending up on the street, now you're homeless. Middle class families, they could lose a house, right? But they might have to downsize, right? So they might not be able to keep a larger home, so they might have to downsize to maybe a smaller home or maybe even an apartment, something along those lines. So they will be impacted by recession. People that are wealthy, they may lose money. They might even lose a lot of money. But the idea is they still remain wealthy. They're still going to have their homes. They're still going to have that lifestyle. So recessions do impact people across the board. It's just depending on how well off you are during that recession will determine how well you fare during the recession. Okay? All right, stuff that I really want to talk about. All right, closed systems and open systems. So, it's different kinds of systems depending on the society that you live in. Now, here in the United States, most people will argue that we live in an open system, while some people argue we live in a closed system. So the difference is, closed systems accommodate very little change in social position. What that means is, if you're working class, you can be middle class or wealthy, but it's going to be very difficult for you to do that. You're going to run into a lot of obstacles. We would prefer, as a society, that you stay working class. We're not saying that you can't move up socially, but we're going to make it difficult. Okay. Closed systems do not allow people to shift levels and do not permit social relationships between levels. Okay, so that's another way that a closed system will go ahead and prevent you, if possible, from moving up or moving down socially when it comes to relationships. Okay, and the idea that systems are assigned at birth. So if you're working class, you're born working class family, that's who you are. Okay. That's your birth lottery, right? You're working class now. All right, so the images that I have here. At the very top, that is Prince Charles and Princess Diana. I believe that's got to be their wedding day. Okay, so that's the royal family. So I'd argue, historically, the royal family would be an example of a closed system, okay, within the British Empire, right? So the idea is if you're somebody who's in the British family and you want to wed, you want to get married, they're going to push you or encourage at the very least, but almost force you, worst case scenario, to marry somebody who also has social rank, who also has a title, okay? So that's the idea. So you can argue that the royal family historically might have pushed for individuals to marry within their own circles, okay? So that would be an example of a closed system, right? Marriage. So Prince Charles, Princess Diana, they would consider that to be a good fit, okay? And then we have open systems. And open systems are based on achievement, allow movement and interaction between layers and classes. So most people would argue that within the United States, we live in an open system. So the idea is if you work hard, you're skilled, motivated, you should be successful, right? Okay. Now the difference is that there's certain cultural values that shape individuals in these belief system, in this belief system, right? So the idea is that we argue that you should be able to move up in our society, right? That this is a land of opportunity, and that we can, as long as we're willing to put in the effort, move up. But the problem or the mistake that you might run into with that belief system is that it ignores the obstacles that are in place. Okay? And the argument, not the argument, but really what it comes down to is that when you believe in an open system, you believe in a system that is based on merit or meritocracy, right? Which essentially those that are successful because they are deserving of that success. Okay? That's what we believe we have here in our country. If you are successful here, it's because you worked hard, you're talented, and you deserve it. Okay. So we'll talk more about meritocracy. So back to the image, right? So the top you have Prince Charles and Princess Diana, and I argue that's more of a representation of a closed system. And then on the bottom you have Prince Charles and Princess Diana's son, Harry, all right, Prince Harry, and his wife, Meghan. Okay. If you're not familiar with royal families, we'll go into a little history. So Meghan is not British. So that's one thing that Prince Harry did that goes against the closed system, right? He married somebody who's not British. He married somebody who doesn't have title, right? She doesn't have a title. He married somebody who is, if you want to even go there, who's biracial. So she's African American, or identifies as. So that's 3. She's older than him, so 4, and she's a divorcee, 5. So that's 5 things that probably never would have happened in a closed system. Okay, in a closed system, Prince Charles would never have been able to marry Meghan. All right, so now times have changed. Prince Harry meets Meghan, he marries her. That's an open system. The system allowed for him to marry her, so she was allowed to move up socially, okay? And he was allowed to date down socially, which doesn't happen in a closed system. Or doesn't happen very often, or if it does happen, it is pretty much very rare, okay? And then we have caste systems. Now, caste systems are essentially closed systems of stratification. But the thing with caste systems, they're going to be much more rigid. Okay, and a very rigid caste system that we have still to this day is in India. Some people argue that we even have a very rigid caste system here in the United States, but that's a whole other conversation. But India is known for having a very rigid caste system that they still adhere to, despite their efforts to kind of abolish that practice. It's still something that holds sway within the country of India. So the caste system is a closed system of stratification that provides little or nothing or no change in social standing. So essentially what that it's saying is that it offers no chance or no ability to move up in the social system. Okay? If you're born at the bottom, that's it. You will stay at the bottom. And in a caste system, there are going to be jobs. So say if you were born at the very bottom of the caste system. So here on the image, it'll say outcast, right? Or I'll probably pronounce it wrong. the Dalits. So Dalits would be individuals who are street sweepers, latrine cleaners. So if you're born at the very bottom of the caste system, there's jobs that are assigned to you that are appropriate for your caste. There are women and men that you're appropriate as far as marriage. Like you can only marry within your own caste system. You can only work certain jobs that are assigned for your caste. Like there's entire areas where only these people live. So that makes it a very rigid, closed system. Okay, so caste system is a closed system, but is a very rigid form of it. Okay, it's very similar. People are born into the social standing and will remain there their entire lives. There is no opportunity for you to move up and down in the system. There's even been reports of people in India who were born in lower caste systems, excuse me, that were able to move up. And the only reason why they're able to move up is because they were able to move out of India. Okay, so leaving India greatly increases your odds of being able to move up socially. But I've even watched stories about certain ethnic enclaves here in the United States from India, and they still hold to those caste systems. So the idea is, say you have an ethnic enclave of people from India living here in Orange County. Those people in that enclave will still hold to that caste system. So if somebody, within that community is found out to be a Dalit, or a Shudra, that's they will be forced to kind of keep those jobs even here in the United States. So a lot of those practices die very hard. Okay, and in the caste system, individuals are socialized to accept their position within the system, so not to challenge the current system. This is where I was born. This is the class I was born into. So why fight it? Why challenge it? They just accept that. That's just the way that it is, okay? And there's virtually no opportunities to improve social position, okay? Those doors are closed for you. And as far as marriage, marriage is going to be, essentially you can only marry partners of the same social background, right? Endogamous marriage. So essentially you are marrying individuals. So if today in the United States, if the United States was a rigid caste system, okay? If you were working class, the only job you could have if you're born to the working class would be blue-collar jobs, working class jobs, okay? You could only marry people who are also born into working class. You can't marry anybody in the middle class, and you definitely can't marry anybody in the, we consider, the wealthy or the wealthy class of, Americans. So that would be an example how it would work here in the United States. And some people argue that our United States still is a rigid caste system. But there is opportunity for movement, though. All right, so class systems. Like I said, I told you guys I'm sorry. A lot of the terms are kind of bleeding into one another. So I do apologize for that, but that's the way they're presented in the book, so that's where we're going to cover them. Okay? So I'll try not to, for testing purposes, make the questions too confusing as far as what I'm asking for. Okay? So class systems are open for the most part based on social factors like individual achievement. So now we're getting into the realm of meritocracy, right? So in the United States, we do have a class system, I'd argue, right? There is opportunity for movement, but it's going to be very difficult to do that. Share similar status with regard to factors like wealth, income, education, occupation. So that's what the class systems would be. So working class, middle class, wealthy, those would be class systems, okay? People are free to gain different level of education or employment than their parents. The idea is if you're born to working class parents, depending on how well you do, you can be middle class or even wealthy. So you can move up and down the class system within the United States. You can socialize with and marry members of other classes, and you definitely can here. There's no law preventing you from marrying somebody who's wealthy, right? Or preventing you from marrying somebody who's poor. Thank God, right? Because that's my goal. I don't know about you, but marrying rich would be amazing. I'd love to marry rich. But if I was going to marry, that's the only way I'd do it. Marry wealthy. So, exogamous marriages, unions of spouses from different social categories. And that's something that we have here in the United States. Okay? We haven't always had it, I'd argue to some extent, but we have it now. Okay, marriage is based on love and compatibility rather than social standing or economics. So the argument is, when it comes to marriage, that we marry people here based on love. So, and I would agree to that to a certain extent. I mean, I argue that I know a lot of people who've gotten married, and I'm sure you guys know a lot of people who've gotten married. And the idea is, the people that we know who've gotten married, and if you even married yourself, you married that person because you loved them, and that was the most important part of that relationship, right? That marriage, or the idea of entering into a marriage with somebody, right? You're not going to enter into an arrangement to be married with somebody when you don't love them, or that person doesn't love you, right? That's a crucial component for us here in the United States. Other countries, not so much. Okay. And then social pressures still exist that encourage people to choose partners within their own class systems. People are not as pressured to choose marriage partners based on solely these elements, but it's something that's still there. And an example of this would be, and it's horrible to say this, but grandmas. I pick on grandmas a lot because I think grandmas still hold on to a lot of outdated concepts, social concepts, but those are social concepts that are still around. And I guess what I mean by this is, if you've ever dated somebody outside of your cultural ethnic group, you might have somebody in your family. It doesn't have to be a grandma. I just use grandma as an example. But you might have somebody in your family, maybe somebody who's older than you, maybe a parent, grandparent, but an older person who would say something like, "You should stick to your own kind." Marriages are better when you marry somebody who's your own kind. Okay? So some of you may have experienced this in your own families, maybe some of you haven't, okay? But that's kind of what the idea is with this, is that there will be some kind of social pressure to marry somebody who is of the same religion, the same cultural background, the same maybe ethnic racial background, okay? That does still exist. And there may be social sanctionings or social sanctions for individuals who choose not to marry somebody of their own cultural background. Okay, so that's one way class systems can move forward, or make it difficult for people to move up and down class systems. Could be the idea that there'd be social pressure to stick with your own kind. All right, meritocracy. I'm going to pick on meritocracy for a bit. So meritocracy, we brought it up, right? Bootstrap theory, social mobility, all those things. The United States believes in a meritocracy. Okay, that's part of it. And meritocracy essentially argues for a system based on the belief that social stratification, so essentially how well you do in your life in this country, is going to be the result of personal effort or merit that determines how well you're doing or your social standing. Okay, so high levels of effort will lead to a high social position, and vice versa. Low levels of effort will lead to low social standing or low social position. So this is the argument with the meritocracy, is that if you're willing to work hard, like I said, right, American Dream, Bootstrap theory, if you're willing to work hard and you're talented, you will be rewarded. And if you're not talented and you're not willing to work hard, then you will not be rewarded. Okay? So meritocracy is going to affect your social standing. Okay? And social standing is influenced by multiple factors, not just merit alone. Okay? But merit is a big one because people believe in this. Okay? And the reason why people believe in it is because it's tough not to believe in it. We've been socialized to believe in it. We've grown up with this idea, this concept that if we work hard, we'll be successful. That's something that we're raised with. Okay? It's hard to not believe in it. It's hard to challenge it when it's something that's kind of ingrained in us. But the problem I have with meritocracy, as far as being a system that we live under, right, that is a reality, is that I don't believe that it works in the way that they argue that it works, right? And the way they argue that it works is if you work hard, you'll be successful. But I think this only applies to the middle class and below, poor, working class, middle class. Meritocracy applies to them, but it doesn't apply for the wealthy. Okay? And the reason why I believe this is the reason why I'll argue for this, is that let's say middle class, right? Let's talk about the middle class. And I have talked about this quite a bit. I do apologize, but it's important. So if I'm middle class, like I said, I don't have enough money to make sure that my kids, as they grow into adulthood, will have a middle class life. My kids are going to have to fend for themselves in that sense, right? I can provide all the resources growing up that they need to give them the best chance. And what example that would be college, right? So I provide the best, I put my kids in the best private schools I can afford. I give my kids all the tutoring that they need. I provide them with all the extracurricular activities for sports or music, or whatever they need to do so they can go ahead and, get into university and make sure they look, amazing when it comes to applications, right? This is a well-rounded student. They get good grades. They are a football player or whatever it is. They do all these wonderful things, but all those things cost money. So as a middle-class father, as a parent, I could provide all those things for my kids. But at the end of the day, if my kid is not able to take all those resources and create their own middle class life that they maintain on their own, they don't get to stay middle class. Okay? They will fail. And something that's kind of alarming is that our generation would be the first generation that is not going to do as well as our parents. Okay? So there's a lot of things going on right now that's going to make it very difficult for us to move up into the middle class, and if you're middle class, to stay in the middle class. Okay, this is a problem. So meritocracy, I'd argue, applies for the most part. I can't say all the time or always. I don't like using always for things. But for the most part, applies to middle class and working class families. Wealthy families will stay wealthy regardless of education. I know some people might have a problem with that statement, but, I guess bear with me for a second, right? So let's say you were born into a very wealthy family, and let's pick a wealthy family. Let's say a family like the Waltons. The Waltons is the family that owns Walmart. The Waltons are wealthy. Actually, I think they're the wealthiest family in America. If they're not the wealthiest, they're probably close to it. And I want to argue that they're worth, I don't know, maybe like $100 billion, something ridiculous, like $94 billion or $95 billion or something just ridiculous. The Waltons are so rich that, well, let's put it this way. The business that the Waltons are engaged in, like I said, they own Walmart, generates $1 million, I think it was, every hour or something just unfathomable. Like every hour the Waltons make another $1 million. That's how wealthy this family is. So let's say I was born into the Walton family, right? That's my family. Exceedingly wealthy. Now, I will have access to the best education, the best schools, you name it, I'm there. But the wealth that I have as a member of the Walton family, as an adult, you can argue isn't the result of your education. So it's not like I'm going to go to, Duke or Yale or Princeton or Harvard and get out, and then make my own fortune. I'm going to inherit my money. So even if I go to an Ivy League school, get the best education, and come out, like the idea is that the money that I'm going to have access to is a result of the education that I earned. Like I'm not making billions of dollars because I went to Harvard. Now you could go to one of these schools and come out and do very well for yourself, and the money you make is a direct result of your education. You're using that education to earn that money. If you're wealthy and you're born to a wealthy family, you could have an Ivy League education, but that education isn't going to be what ensures that you're going to be wealthy. It's the fact that you're born to a wealthy family that ensures that. So meritocracy maybe doesn't really work or doesn't apply to wealthy families. Because the idea is, right, with meritocracy, if you're a billionaire, it's because you worked for it. If you're wealthy, it's because you worked for it. But if you're wealthy because your family gave it to you, where's the work? Where's the merit? Right? So that's how I feel about meritocracy. That's my critique of it. Some of you may agree, some of you may not. Tell me in the discussion boards. Okay, moving forward. Status consistency. Okay, once again, apologize. A lot of these words are going to bleed into one another. So status consistency, essentially social stratification systems that determine social position based on factors like income, education, occupation. So this is just another term for how people stay in the positions that they're in, right? So if you're working class, your status consistency is going to be based on how much money you make, the education you received, and the occupation that you have. Okay, education is the key to success. I do believe this. Education will definitely. It's not a guarantee, right? It's not guaranteed that you'll be successful if you get education. Okay, there's no guarantees, but it's definitely going to increase your odds. Okay, that you will become successful. And it could be something along the lines of maybe you go to college somewhere and you get a degree, right? And maybe the degree in and of itself isn't enough to ensure that you're successful, but maybe it's one of those deals where you make friends. You make friends with other people that you go to school with, your cohort. You make friends with other staff members. You meet people. Maybe you get an internship somewhere and you go work for a company. So education isn't just the knowledge that you receive, but it's also the networks that you gain access to that can help you become successful. Okay, very important. So status consistency argues it'll argue pretty much the same thing we've been arguing this entire time. The caste systems correlate with high status consistency. And what that's arguing is that if you're wealthy, it stands to reason that you will remain wealthy because of the position you were born into. Okay, so like I said, this status consistency term isn't bringing anything new to the table. Okay, so I just don't want you guys to get confused or let this bleed into other concepts that we've been going over. It's another way of pretty much explaining what we've already been talking about. All right, so these are the concepts that we do have to cover. Nothing too complicated here, really. So standard of living really is just the level of wealth available to a certain socioeconomic class in order to acquire the material necessities and comforts to maintain its lifestyle. So pretty much this is just arguing your standard of living is pretty much going to determine what you have access to. Okay, so if you're rich, you have access to homes, travel, education, entertainment, vehicles. Like you have access to resources or things that other people in society do not have access to simply because they don't have the money. They cannot afford it. Okay, and that's what the standard of living is. It's based on factors such as income, employment, class, poverty rates, and housing affordability. So because the standard of living is closely related to quality of life, it can represent factors such as the ability to afford a home, own a car, and take vacations. Okay, like I said, nothing complicated here. It's just a concept that we're going to, we need to be familiar with just because it's important. But like I said, not particularly a lot going on here. All right, and because, I want to make sure you guys understand this, and I do apologize if I've kind of talked about this ad nauseum, but it is important. The middle class. And I do think the middle class is very, very important within our society for a bunch of different reasons. So the middle class is the most significant threat to the relatively high standard of living we're accustomed to in the United States. It is the decline of the middle class that we should be concerned with. And right now, the middle class is shrinking. Okay, this is a problem. The size, the income, the wealth of the middle class has essentially been on a decline since the 1970s, right? And this is occurring at a time when corporate profits have increased more than 141%. So pretty much what this is arguing is that since the 1970s, the distance between individuals in a company who are in management or like high-ranking positions like CEOs, CFOs, presidents, vice presidents, and the average worker like managers and things like that, the gap between what they're both paid has slowly been widening. So the idea is, in the 1970s, maybe a vice president or a CEO might have made maybe 60, 70, 80,000 more than the average employee, which would have been like an office manager. Okay, what's happening is that now the CEOs are making millions of dollars more than their average employees, and this is creating a problem, a huge problem. Okay, it's creating essentially a system that's not stable, and it's not going to be able to maintain itself. Okay, And the threat and the problem with this is that we need a middle class within our society. The middle class provides a buffer between the wealthy and the poor. It gives people something to strive towards, right? A middle class life is a life of comfort. Okay, so if you look at the image to the right, you have examples of what make up a middle class life. You have home ownership, you have access to vehicles, you can purchase vehicles, health and retirement security, which means you're able to invest, you're able to take care of children, provide everything that you need for those children, college education, medical, everything. And then family vacations. So that's going to be expendable income, right? So if you're middle class, it's not so much a dollar amount per se, because you might have a hard time locking down a dollar amount for middle class, because it's going to vary from state to state. So what I mean by that is, in Orange County, to be middle class, you might have to make, let's just say, anywhere from $80,000 to $100,000 a year, right, to be middle class. So $80,000 to $100,000 a year, you might be able to purchase a home, a car, provide for health care, maybe save for retirement, and if you have children, to support those children, and still be able to do extracurricular activities like family vacations, things like that, hobbies, right? So let's say 80 to 100,000 Orange County. 80 to 100,000 middle class Orange County is doable. 80 to 100,000 middle class in the Bay Area and San Francisco is not doable. Okay, so 80,000 is not going to be enough, or 100,000 is not going to be enough to provide a middle class life in San Francisco. So that's what I mean by it's not so much a dollar amount. I've had friends that have moved to Arizona because they can live a middle class life in Arizona for $50,000 a year, $60,000 a year. They can live a very comfortable life, and that's what the middle class is. The middle class is a life of comfort. And the problem is that the middle class is slowly but surely shrinking. Okay, and this is a problem. Okay, so we have the concept of relative poverty and absolute poverty. So relative poverty is essentially not having enough money to live the lifestyle of the average person in your country. Okay, so we're going to argue within our country, the average person, well, let's think about that, right? What is the average person in our country? Is it middle class? I'd probably say no. It's definitely not wealthy. So let's say the middle class person in our society is working class, okay? So the average, so if we're going to use this, right, relative poverty concept, if you live in a country where you base how well you're doing off of how close you are to that working class, it would be considered relative poverty, right? Not having the means to live the lifestyle of the average person. So what I mean by this, and I guess an example would be access to transportation, right? So in our society, in our country, okay, you have access to transportation for the most part. Okay, depending on where you live. Now, some places have better transportation setups than others, but you still have access to it. So let's just say here, this image here. This is a bus, right? I'm sure some of you, a lot of you have taken the bus. I have taken the bus. All right. Bus, for some people, is ideal, right? They enjoy the bus. Some people do not. I did not enjoy my time on the bus. Now, it wasn't the bus itself that bothered me. It was the waiting. I didn't like the waiting, and I didn't like the gamble as far as people on the bus. People on the bus can be interesting, okay? But at the end of the day, it's still transportation, okay? This is still what I would consider a luxury, right? So in the United States, in Southern California, LA County, Orange County, right, you have public transit. And it's provided to us at a minimal cost. And sometimes even free. If you're a student at Santa Ana College, I believe bus fare is free. Okay? So relative poverty. Not having the means to live the lifestyle of the average person in your country. That's us. Okay? I might not have the means to purchase a car. I have to take a bus. Okay? Or if you have the means to purchase a car, you might have only enough to purchase a little Chevy Spark, right? Some people might look at that little Chevy Spark and laugh at it. Okay? It's still a car. It's got AC. It's got power windows. It can seat like 4 people. Maybe not comfortably, but that's 4 people you can fit in that little car. Keeps you out of the rain. Like, that is a luxury. Okay, and then you have something like a Tesla. So here in the United States, we argue we live based on relative poverty. You may not have the means to live the lifestyle of the average person, but you still have access to certain things. So let's say the average person is a Chevy Spark, right? That's average, a little compact car. That's basic average vehicle. So that's us. Maybe most of us can only afford an average vehicle. Some of us might not be able to afford that, but there's still buses, and some people might be doing better than a Chevy Spark, and they can afford something like a Tesla. Okay, and that's the easiest way to consider or measure the level of poverty in an individual country, is to look at it and argue, now are the people that are living in relative poverty, where they might not have the means to live the average life, but they still have access to those things. Okay, and the next way to look at it would be absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is something entirely different. Now, if you look at a country and you say, well, it's not relative poverty, it's absolute poverty, what you're saying is that the people that live in that country are essentially at risk of dying based on their inability or the lack of resources, okay, or access to resources. So essentially what you're looking at is, if you live in an area, in a country, where you do not have access to food, you do not have access to safe drinking water, you don't have access to sanitation facilities, essentially bathrooms, okay? You don't have access to healthcare, you don't have access to shelter, education, and information are pretty much the same thing, right? If you don't have access to those things, you live in absolute poverty. Now, it doesn't mean, I'm not saying you have to have access to all of them to be absolute poverty. Just one of those could be enough to argue you live in absolute poverty. Like I said, there are a lot of homeless people here within our country, and that is a problem. So I'm hoping that I'm not arguing this the wrong way, or arguing this way in a situation where it might be insensitive, because I'm not trying to be insensitive. I'm just trying to look at it, sociologically. So even within our country here, if you're homeless, there are options for you. You can you can go to a shelter. There are facilities that can help you. There are places where you can get food banks, things like that. You have access to internet. You can go to a public library, and for free get a library card, have access to books, access to information, access to those things, okay? So even as hard as it may be to be homeless, and I know it is difficult, but you still have access to those resources because they're still provided, at some level, okay? In absolute poverty, they're not provided, okay? So like I said, you could live in a country that's considered, a country of absolute poverty because you don't have access to, food and water. You might have access to sanitation facilities, maybe some shelter, but if food and water is not available to you, then you may risk dying. So essentially, that's the way you look at it, or you should look at it. Ask yourself, if the individual living in that country is at risk of dying because they don't have access to at least one of these things, it's probably a situation where it's absolute poverty. If your life is in jeopardy is kind of the focal point, the determining factor, okay? So if you look at the images here, you have individuals who are using this river here for essentially as a water source, and that they're using it for bathing, they're using it for washing clothes, they're using it for gathering actual water for drinking. The image in the middle, you have children here that are rummaging through huge garbage piles looking for pretty much anything of use. When I mean use, anything they can use to build shelters, anything they can use to sell, anything they can find as far as food. And then you have shelters into the last image on the right. This is like a shanty town. You have makeshift shelters built out of wood and just like steel, corrugated steel. And if you look in the middle there, it looks like there's like a little area where, there might be like a little like a line dug out, and that's going to be your sanitation facility. Essentially, you use, you urinate and you defecate into a bucket, something along those lines, and then you would empty that out into the little area outside. You essentially dump it out there. Okay. Each one of these images here, these individuals, their life is in jeopardy. Survival is in jeopardy. That's poor shelter, that's poor sanitation facilities, which creates the threat of disease, life is in jeopardy. Access to food. This boy here looking for food, life's in jeopardy. To the left here, the water. That's poor drinking water. You can get sick from that. Life is in jeopardy. The image that we have here, or not the image, but the link that we have here is for a video about the guinea worm. The guinea worm is a worm that sits on the top of water. It's a parasite, and when you drink this parasite and you ingest it, that parasite turns into a worm that lives in your body for about a year. And once it gets too big, and too big is about 2 to 3 feet, what that guinea worm will do is exit the body. And it can exit anywhere in your body, but for some reason it likes to exit somewhere down on the bottom extremities, so your feet, your lower legs. So essentially, and I put the video on there so you guys can watch it, but if you're squeamish and you don't want to watch it, I totally understand. It's just an example of how important safe, clean drinking water is. That's what this video is about. It's about people struggling to find water that isn't infested with this worm, okay? And it is a horrible thing to watch people pull out a 2 to 3 foot worm out of your foot, and that's what that video is. So if that's your water source, you live in absolute poverty. Okay. All right, so this, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we already kind of talked about this. Social class in the United States is a fluid concept. 3 levels of class in the United States, and we already talked about this. Working class, or blue collar, middle class, and then wealthy. And in the United States, you have the ability to move up and down these social classes. Okay, so I'm not going to spend any more time on this because we already talked about it. Okay, power and control. This is an interesting concept, not very complicated. It's essentially the amount of power and control an individual has over their own lives and the lives of others will determine how much power you have within society. So the upper class not only have power over and control over their own lives, but they also have control and status that gives them power and control over other people's lives. Okay, the middle class doesn't generally control other strata or other parts of society for the most part, but its members do exert control over their own lives. And then the lower class, they have no power or control for the most part. So wealthy people are powerful because they have the ability to control their lives and the lives of other people around them. So example of that would be, I'd say, like politicians, okay? Powerful. Wealthy businessmen, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, people like that. People that have that much money, that much power, control their lives and the lives of people around them. And large amounts of people around them, okay? The upper class, I would consider that all upper class. Middle class people, for the most part, don't have a lot of power for them. They do to a certain extent when it comes to like voting. They do have the ability to influence, but it's very limited. The middle class, at least in my opinion, the middle class is worried about just staying middle class. That's really the way I see it. Okay, the middle class is struggling to stay middle class, so they're not really concerned about people that are poorer than them. They're not really concerned with people that are wealthier than them for the most part. They're looking to just control their own lives to make sure that they stay in the middle class. And like I said, lower class, they just lack power and control over their own lives and no control over the lives of anybody else, unfortunately. All right, and we've talked about the middle class a lot now. Now the book, I don't know why the book does this. The book breaks the middle class into like different groups. So there's a middle class, and they have upper middle class and lower middle class. I'm not going to hold you guys to this at all, okay? Because like I said, to me, it's just kind of redundant, and it gets kind of confusing, okay? So all you guys got to be familiar with is just what the middle class is, okay? It's a lifestyle of comfort and stability, okay? That's all I want you guys to be familiar with. Like this image here of this family, right? They got a house in the back. They got stuff, little plants. They got kids. Kids got toys. They got the dog. Like they got their American dream, right? They got a stable, comfortable life within this country. That is middle class, and that's really all you need to know. Okay, I'm not gonna hold you to anything else. Okay, lower class, like I said before, think of Roseanne, right? This is a lower class, working class, blue collar family. Like I said. Lower class, working class, for me, the words are, they're the same for me. The definitions are the same, okay? So I'm not going to hold you to that. I'm not going to ask you questions to differentiate between lower class and working class. Just be familiar with this class system and what it is, okay? And essentially what it is a group of individuals who are essentially responsible for doing the heavy lifting within society, in my opinion, okay? And this would be the largest, what they consider subcategory of working class or of society. So essentially, these are going to be the individuals that are performing duties such as that will be considered blue collar work. So working with their hand, menial labor, manual labor would be considered blue class or blue collar jobs or working class jobs. This would be like mechanics, plumbers, construction workers, things like that. We consider working class jobs. Okay. And not to say that and I'm not knocking working class jobs or blue collar jobs, because actually what's funny is that working class and blue collar jobs now, especially trades like plumbers, electricians, concrete, cement workers, things like that, like they're actually making a lot of money. Like I know people that are electricians that make 6 figures. So right now, blue collar jobs are looking pretty good for a lot of people. Trades. And then you have the working poor, okay? So the working poor, like the working class, are unskilled. They essentially have low-paying employment, very little job security, very little access to healthcare or no healthcare. The problem with working poor is a lot of the jobs that they do have are seasonal, so it could be a lot of migrant workers. It could be considered working class or working poor, I should say. So when the seasons change, the jobs go away. Okay, an example the book used was sharecroppers, migrant farm workers, house cleaners, day laborers. Like I said, poorly educated. Okay, so the image here is this old man. Like I couldn't imagine being this man's age. I'm guessing this guy's got to be at least in his 60s, late 60s, early 70s, walking around pushing a cart all day long. He's barely making enough money probably to maybe feed himself, maybe maintain a little room somewhere in a house. Like, who knows what this guy's living situation is exactly, but I'm guessing it is not going to be one that is comfortable, okay? And like I said, it breaks it up to working poor and underclass. I'm not going to go with the differences between those two. Just be familiar with the fact that these individuals face little to no job security whatsoever. The money that they make is barely enough to afford a living, and more often than not, it's not enough to afford a living. Okay. All right. Social mobility. We've talked about this already. Like I said, the book for some reason this chapter repeats itself a lot. So social mobility, you guys know what this is. Upward mobility, you know what this is. This is meritocracy. This is the chance to move up depending on how skilled and hardworking you are. Downward mobility is the ability for essentially you to drop status within society. Okay. You can marry somebody of a lower class. You can choose to have a profession that's different. So the idea is maybe your family's wealthy and you choose to, pursue a career or profession that wouldn't necessarily afford you a life of wealth. But that's, your choice. So that would be downward social mobility, right? If your parents are wealthy and you choose to be a school teacher, right? Being a school teacher is going to afford you a life of wealth. So that would be an example of downward social mobility. Intergenerational mobility is something we've already talked about. This is essentially the idea that, if your family's wealthy, you're born into that wealthy family, you will be wealthy yourself, as long as that family decides to, let you in and allow you to inherit whatever that wealth is. Okay, so intergenerational mobility is something we've already covered. Structural mobility, we've talked about these things. Like I said, I'm not going to be testing you guys on these. I don't want you to focus on that. I want you to focus on the stuff that we kind of covered before. That's the important stuff. I don't want you to get confused with the terms. And like I said, for testing purposes, when I provide you with the study guides, I'll have the terms on there that I really want you to focus on. Okay? All right, so that's going to be Chapter 9. I'm going to go ahead and post the videos for the discussion boards. And if you have any questions, as always, just go ahead and shoot me an email. As far as grades, I'm updating those grades right now. Like I said, a lot of people missed some of the deadlines, so I got to go back through and kind of, cache those things and upgrade them. But like I said, I'm going to upgrade them. Let me know if it's not upgraded in your side. I've had issues where I've upgraded the grade book on my side, but for some reason it's not showing up on your end. So I've had some students with those issues. So just let me know if there's anything going on. We'll take care of it, okay? So like I said, have a good day.